Hi, this is Tim from Racing Central, and welcome to my review of F1 Manager 2022. I started to draft this article after 3 races, and now that I'm on my second season of managerial duties, more than 24 races into the game, my positive opinion of the game hasn't changed much since, but my experience has. I begun my previous draft talking about how much I was struggling to cope with the McLaren being the 8th fastest car on the grid, and that Lando was doing amazing things to get us anywhere near the top 10. Each race, I'd either made a strategic mistake, or we'd ended up just outside the points on pace. But next came Imola. We were starting, as usual, just outside the top 10. The difference this weekend? Rain in the forecast. Our weather centre lacks the capability to give in-depth information, but after a few laps it began to update and I see it coming. The rain begins on lap 8 of 63 with our cars running 11th and 12th. A lap later, the track is getting damp and a depth of over 1mm will require intermediate tyres, but the forecast suggests I'll need wets soon enough. I enter the pits with my lead car Ricciardo, leaving Norris to run another lap like the cars ahead of him. By the time Norris clears the pit exit on the racetrack, it's wet enough for intermediates, but not wet enough for wets. Though I feel good about my decision to pit because some cars behind me followed me in. Ricciardo exits his stop in 16th place onto nearly 2mm of surface water, already too much to be on slick tyres. I've made the perfect call. With the strategy played out, I found myself in 3rd place with Ricciardo, with Lando down in 7th, pitting the next lap, in a vastly inferior car. As long as the rain continued, I was safe, but once it dried up later in the race, I began to lose positions, and fast. I got desperate, worried that I was going to drop outside the top 10, so I began to play around with the ERS. Could I recharge throughout the lap to defend on the only viable passing spot? Yes I could, and it worked brilliantly. I was able to keep who became my season-long rivals, Alpine, stuck behind me. Even though Ricciardo ran wide and damaged the floor, which lost him some overall pace, I was able to use the ERS to bring him home 9th, while Lando had fought his way to 6th. It had taken 4 races for me to score any points, and it's no exaggeration to say that bringing home points in this race made me feel the genuine race of adrenaline and emotion I've felt in wheel-to-wheel sim races where I was in control of the car. We had absolutely no business finishing in the points, let alone running as high as we did, but it gave me hope that after I improve the car, we'll see some better results. And we did. The biggest decision you'll ever make. When choosing your team, you'll be presented with a 4-tab profile of the selected team, and it's very important that you pay attention to the car performance row in the team performance tab if you want to start with a strong team right away, because this is where you choose how hard you want F1 Manager 2022 to be. My first season playthrough with McLaren was initially frustrating, with only the 8th fastest car on the grid. This may change prior to release, but the point stands. We were at first unable to finish within the expectations of sponsors, board members, and myself. We struggled to make Q3 and frustratingly battled for 12th to 14th most race weekends. It's important to understand that Frontier will have tried to simulate the 2022 season in how they've set up these teams and drivers. However much I might like Daniel Ricciardo and think he might do better in another car or for another team, he struggled to get the best out of the McLaren this season and in real life throughout practice and qualifying. Every early season race weekend in F1 Manager 2022, I found myself frustrated at how much more difficult it was for him to reach a car setup he was happy with, and I ended up often transferring Lando Norris's setup to his car at the end of the first practice session to try to speed up the process. However frustrating, there is something to be said for taking on a challenge, and McLaren might feel like one at first. However, McLaren has a good budget and a good roster of staff, so improving the car is something you'll certainly be able to do. The bigger challenge will be slower teams with no reasonable financial support, even though expectations within those teams will be lower. This is where my first disappointing thoughts crept in as I realized there was no option to set up your own team. This appears to have been a mixture of game design and licensing limitations with sponsors, as you cannot change any of the sponsors any teams has. You can only renegotiate the terms. The main screen has a selection of buttons across the bottom with clickable information boxes filling out the space of the page itself. Over time, you'll learn which to visit after every race and which to ignore for months at a time. The depth of information you'll access from this main screen in F1 Manager 2022 is something I am still coming to terms with after more than 30 hours of gameplay. It actually feels a little bit overwhelming, which is why it's tremendously useful that most major needs will trigger an email to be sent to remind you, and it won't allow you to continue if you have to deal with something. I've been a fan of Formula One for decades, so when I tell you it feels like every aspect of the sport is touched on in some way, even if they have simplified some of it for the purposes of making a game, you'll have to take my word on it. I'm fairly hands-off on car design so far, and just threw a bunch of money and time and engineers at every improvement I wanted to make. With a team like McLaren, this is easy. But the smaller teams with generally worse designers and not enough money to rush the production, you'll see much smaller gains. You'll end up micromanaging things, checking track characteristics, and trying to design specific aero parts more useful in low, medium, or high-speed turns, and overall top speed, so you can fit it to the next weekend. I suspect this is how you will both win championships and give smaller teams the occasional shock result you so desperately need. Fitting parts is quick and easy. You can change parts between every session and at any time during them. Parc Fermé applies after FP3. So running that experimental front wing for all or part of a session to see whether it helps or not is definitely a thing. Throughout the season, you will need to begin work on the car for the following season too. Regulation changes happen, so it's important to research those changes when notified and give yourself a chance against the competition. Both the drivers and staff screens allow you to scout for new hirings, offer contracts, and apply development points. Some start out at a high rating but are incapable of growth, while others you might hire quickly improve and become the better option. If you follow F2 and F3, it's actually really interesting seeing how good of a job Frontier have done at picking talent. I found myself multiple times looking at a driver I watched and respected on the track be a decent potential hire in the game. Reserve drivers can gain experience and are assigned points from driving in FP1 sessions in place of your main drivers. This is your main way to successfully bring a youngster into your team if you do not want to hire from a competitor. The running of the reserve driver in FP1 does pass a little bonus onto the main driver they replaced for the session, so it's not a complete loss for them. The second thing to disappoint me about the game overall is contract negotiations when hiring someone new, which happens instantly via buyouts rather than coming into effect at a specific future date. Take my driver, Ricciardo. In real life, his departure from Renault happened in May 2020 for the 2021 season. You cannot do this in F1 Manager 2022 and must hire him instantly. You'll visit the screen before every race because this is where you will prepare for each event by making sure the car has the proper parts fitted, sponsor goals are set, and more. It's important to maintain a set of worn practice parts and fresher race parts you fit before qualifying. If you don't, you'll lose pace and end up replacing them anyway. You also want to keep plenty of spares built, especially if you have an accident-prone driver. During my first season, Ricciardo backed the car into the wall one weekend and destroyed the chassis and gearbox. This had a knock-on effect for a few races until I eventually took a penalty and added another engine, gearbox, and ERS to my rotation. One of the best ways to make money is also tucked away here under performance targets. You can guarantee your results with the sponsor, pledging to reach Q2, Q3, finishing in specific positions in qualifying or the race, and more. Beware though, there are penalties if you get it wrong. Over the 3 practice sessions, your goal is to get as close to an optimum setup as you can, while also building your driver's track familiarity. I generally send out both drivers on hard tyres for a 15 to 17 lap run until they report on the car's handling. After they return to the pit lane, I adjust the setup, comparing both drivers for clues if one of them didn't do as well, and then send them out again on the same tyres until the end of FP1 with the setup adjustments made. You can also run your reserve driver in FP1, but obviously your replaced driver has less track familiarity, and this can lead to more errors in future sessions at the racetrack. Wet and dry weather doesn't seem to make a difference to the car setup, which is a little disappointing, but obviously you need to have the right tyre fitted if the track gets wet. Usually by the end of FP2 I have their setups most of the way there, but at some tracks and with some drivers it can be difficult to read which way the setup needs to go. During my first season I used the safety car and weather interruptions to punch well above my weight and get results the car wasn't otherwise capable of. It's given me a real appreciation for just how difficult it is in the heat of the moment to make the right decision, and built my level of respect for those who do the job each race weekend. Typical scenarios include starting a qualifying session on a dry track where rain is forecast to begin in the next 2 or 4 minutes. Get your car out on the track as soon as you can. I found it funny how often Alonso was also quick to take advantage of this one, even though he was in one of the AI teams. He's also impossible to pass in the race, by the way.
Verstappen is out of the race. Okay.
Another scenario is pitting on a safety car that is anywhere near your pit window, or that allows you to switch strategy entirely with a free pit stop. But pay careful attention to how closely cars are following behind you, because you could lose a lot of the advantage gained stuck behind them after the race restarts. Setting strategy for the race properly is something that only truly clicked with me very late in the season. You will be presented with a graph that shows the expected decline in the tyre and can adjust push levels such as pace, fuel mixture, etc., which will make that graph adjust accordingly. You can map out extreme strategies and see what the overall predicted race time is, but most of the time I found a 1 or 2 stop strategy worked best, because most of the times I used the soft tyre I wasn't able to clear traffic and take advantage of them. Sessions can be accelerated and simulated, but in both practice and qualifying, I found I got best results when hands-on. Before qualifying, you will need to fit your race parts prior to entering Parc Fermé. Qualifying, unless the regulations change in future seasons, consists of 3 sessions like real life, where the slowest cars are knocked out before a 10-car shootout in Q3. Pay attention to the weather and predicted traffic levels, because you can absolutely have a lap ruined by others on their in or out lap. There's always something gratifying about being the last one to cross the line to start a lap with just a few seconds on the clock. As with all other sessions, you can run the race at varying speeds, 1 times, 2 times, 4 times, 8 times and 16 times. When you use 4 times and faster, you cannot watch in TV view, but will be able to click a notification at the top of the screen to watch any major event from the session. While I certainly made use of 16 times a lot to get through a whole season in 30 hours, you don't have to. Honestly, I'm not sure why you'd want to. Unless it's a particularly boring race where your cars aren't around anyone else, you should have plenty to watch and do. I guarantee you can get better results if you are hands-on. I already discussed strategy, so there's not much more to say there. Perhaps one of the most important things to realise is that some weekends just won't work out the way you expect them to. McLaren were leading Alpine by 18 points with 2 races to go during my first season, and it was these races that Lando chose to throw himself off the racetrack after keeping a clean record all season long. We lost out on 4th in the Constructors' Championship right at the end. I pushed hard to finish a season because I wanted to see how the game handled everything. Well, after your board review, you'll renegotiate with your sponsors. You can't change them, probably for licensing reasons. Decide which engine supplier you want, and in some cases, hire a new driver. Make sure you build any new parts you've researched and fit them onto your car before pre-season testing begins, or you'll get inaccurate results. You do not take control during pre-season testing, and instead just get a report via the email screen. This is a beautiful game and really does capture the cars, tracks and various lighting and weather seen in Formula 1 events. At times, it can be visually stunning. However, I am disappointed in the artifacts and ghosting that appears in front of the car and behind the wheels, visible in motion, not often in screenshots. I suspect this is DLSS, and this is the reason why I turn it off in every game that has it, because my system is perfectly capable of running the game without it. The sad bit here, I see no option to disable it in the settings. Frontier have a stellar sound team and have for years. Their collection and delivery in F1 Manager 2022 is nothing short of spectacular. Every sound is perfect, from the engines to the audio haptics of the UI. There is some repetitiveness to the commentary, but nothing that bothers me too much. If you enable guidance in team selection when entering your name, as you should the first time you play, then you'll be shown the basics and dip your toes in everywhere that matters in an effective way over the first couple of races. The guidance is not overwhelming, leaves you things to figure out for yourself, and on-track action will pause whenever you are given a new piece of information. The general game settings are entirely adequate and perhaps purposefully limited to ensure a quality gameplay experience. Options worth mentioning for content creators include the replacement of licensed music, while general users will welcome the ability to choose whether the action is paused for any major dramas or whether you want to deal with things in real time, potentially losing the race because of the time it takes you to decide and take action. There are no difficulty options, and honestly there doesn't need to be. The game is balanced in such a way that, as I said previously, team selection is where you decide how difficult you want things to be. I was a little bit disappointed to see my 32:9 super wide monitor supported, but ultimately not as playable compared to a 16:9. These days, I think it's important to consider whether a game is playable upon release, and F1 Manager 2022 is absolutely something worth purchasing on day one. The most amusing bug in my first full season playthrough saw Lance Stroll bug out in the pit lane, causing yellow to show until Vettel pitted and Stroll disappeared and retired, along with a number of other minor issues that will likely be fixed in future patches. The software has not locked up nor crashed, and really the most annoying bugs are incorrect camera placement on cutscenes, which is something easily fixed. This feels like one of those seminal moments in motorsports gaming. I played the old Grand Prix Manager titles in the 90s, and although there has been management titles in recent years, they just haven't had the atmosphere where I felt disconnected to the game and to the sport. Hearing Ricciardo's actual voice on the radio sounding sad or defeated when he was struggling to provide me with setup feedback was heart-wrenching. The whizzing of cars blasting by the camera position in the curb with a thwap sound from the tyres, and pulling for my driver to complete their pass before realizing I could make a difference with ERS or telling him he could take a little bit more life out of the tyres. It's wonderful. My only truly negative feedback is about the lack of player-owned teams, which perhaps would allow us to be able to change sponsors and get around the various licensing issues that otherwise prevented it. But honestly, this isn't a game breaker. Who knows what Frontier have in store for future updates to this franchise? It's very obvious that an extremely passionate team of designers, developers, and artists worked on this game. I'm excited about that, and I'm excited we have this game. I absolutely love it.